first thing I'm going to teach you is how to play the most common chords on both electric and acoustic guitar. These chords all include open strings, so they're called open chords. First, let me say a few words about holding the guitar. Now, there are a couple of different standard positions that guitar players use. Classical guitarists generally play with the guitar resting on the left leg and slightly elevated. Imagine this is a classical guitar. This puts both hands into a relaxed position with comfortable access along the entire neck. Now, acoustic and electric players usually play with the guitar, if you're sitting down, resting on one leg, and that's a position that's a lot less formal. Or you can cross your legs if that's more comfortable. The key rule, no matter which way you play, is to avoid hunching your back, since this eventually is going to lead to back problems. Now, if you use a strap, the best idea is to adjust the length so that it puts the guitar at approximately the same position relative to your hands as when you're sitting down. Check it out. Now, if the guitar is in a different position when you stand up, it's going to affect how well you can use what you practice. Some people like to put their strap down real low, and that's okay too, but it puts your hand and your wrist in a completely different position than when you're sitting down. So if you practice sitting down and play standing up, it ain't going to be the same. So whichever way you're going to play, make sure you practice that way a good deal of the time. Now, if you got your guitar in position, you're ready to go, let's learn some chords. Some of the most popular chords in popular music are also the simplest, with just two different notes: the root, let's say E, and the note 5 scale steps above it. These are commonly called power chords, and the common chord symbol for a power chord is the name of the root followed by the number 5, as in E5. A power chord shape can have more than two notes, but the other notes are just duplications of either the root or the fifth. Now, to make it easier to describe how to play things, we give each finger a number. The index finger is 1, middle finger is 2, ring finger is 3, and the pinky is number 4. The thumb is referred to as T, or sometimes the thumb. The fret at which the first finger is located is called a position. So, for example, to say that something is in the 7th position means that the first finger is at the 7th fret, with the other fingers playing in the higher frets next to it. Chords or scales that include open strings are described as being in open position. Now, in the open position, there are 3 common power chords, each with its root on one of the open low strings. The E power chord is played using the open low E string, which is the root. The second finger goes here, and the third finger right there. That's the octave. In other words, it's another E. Let's look at exactly how you play these notes, since the basic technique is the same for all chords. The traditional proper position of the fretting hand is with the thumb behind the neck opposite the second finger. So my second finger is at the 2nd fret there, and the thumb is right behind it. The tip of the finger more or less vertically presses the string down just behind the fret. Sometimes you have a problem. It'll sound funny if you put your finger too close to the other fret, so you want it right there behind the fret. Many guitar players grab the neck more like a baseball bat with the thumb over the top, and that's actually the way I play most of the time. A classical teacher will absolutely prohibit you from doing this, but on the electric guitar it's considered normal, and Jimi Hendrix, for example, used the thumb to actually play notes on the 6th string. Now, playing this E chord also involves picking hand technique. The 2 most common picking styles are with either the bare thumb and fingers or with a flat pick. Each has its advantages. At first, bare fingers are easier to use. I can just strum the chord like that, or I can brush my fingers, but the pick definitely offers more versatility, so we're going to work with the flat pick. If you don't have a pick at the moment, go ahead and use your thumb and get a pick as soon as you have a chance. And by the way, picks come in all shapes and sizes, but for starters, I'd recommend a teardrop shaped pick like this with a medium thickness. Picks are cheap, so buy a few different kinds and try them out until you find one that feels right. Now, to hold the pick, you start with your hand held in front of you with the wrist dangling loosely. It's a real natural thing. Okay, totally relaxed. Now turn your hand over, and you'll see that the thumb and the first finger naturally fall together. You stick the pick in there, And that's the right way to hold a pick. It's pretty natural. Some people curl their other fingers up, and some people let them hang. As long as they don't get in the way, either method is fine. Now, finger the E power chord and start playing with all three bottom strings, steady downstrokes. Keep your wrist relaxed and concentrate on hitting the strings evenly. Check to hear that each note is clean by picking the strings separately. If one of the notes sounds muffled or buzzes, you adjust your fingers slightly to clean up the sound. As you practice, you'll learn how to place your fingers in exactly the right place without thinking. Now we're going to add another chord, the A power chord. Put your second finger here on the fourth string and your third finger here on the third string, and pick the fifth string, fourth and third all together. Now this is a little bit trickier because you have to avoid the low E string. Notice I'm aiming the pick so it hits the fifth string and jumps over the sixth string. Now go back and forth between the E and the A chords, hitting each chord 4 times slowly and then changing to the other. Check it out. Changing chords without missing a beat is a little hard to do, and if you find that sometimes you have to stop and think a little bit, then just play a little bit slower. The idea is to be able to play in tempo and get back and forth from one chord to the other. Let's add one more chord before we go and practice. This is called the D power chord, and the root is on the open fourth string. The first finger goes right here on the third string, and the third finger goes here on the second string. It's a little bit different shape because the tuning of those two strings is different, as you remember from our tuning section. Strum that chord a few times. The pick comes down on the fourth string and it comes up before you cross the first string. Now play all three chords back to back, changing smoothly from one to the next. The general rule about changing chords is that you lift and place your fingers as a group, and this is where you want to practice very, very slowly. You play the E chord, look at how each finger is going to move into the A chord. Those two fingers just lift up and move as a team. Think of it like a group of acrobats and you're choreographing the move. So we go from E to A, now it's slightly different going to D, and back to A. You can do this without even picking. You could just see your hands moving from position to position. This should take a little bit of time. If you rush your practicing at this point, you're only going to have a harder time later on. Now, by now your fingers are probably a little bit sore and they might even feel a little bit cramped from the pressure of pressing the strings down. And whenever this happens, just take a short break until your hands start to feel relaxed again. At first, you usually tend to use more strength than you really need, and plus your fingers need to build up calluses, which will take a few days worth of steady playing. And after you do, you'll be able to play for as long as you want. Now, when you have the three chords memorized and you're able to move back and forth without thinking too hard, it's time to play along with practice track number 1. Follow the progression and play with 1 pick stroke for each beat. Then when you have that down, use 2 per beat. But either way, make your chord changes smoothly and never miss a beat. Now watch me as I do a little bit of the track so that you get the idea. Got it? Now go away and work on that, and then come back for the next lesson when you're ready. And by the way, congratulations, you are now officially playing the guitar. Now we're ready to tackle another category of chords, which are called major triads. These chords are at the heart of every style of popular music, and generations of guitar players have started their playing careers with exactly these chords. Now, triads contain 3 different notes, and a major triad is built by adding the major 3rd scale degree to a power chord. Check it out. To play the E major triad, you play the E power chord, and then you add your 1st finger on the 3rd string at the 1st fret. So you wind up with the power chord plus that note. Voila! An E major triad. Now you can play all 6 strings because the 2nd string and the 1st string also belong to that chord. So really, this is about the biggest sounding chord there is on the guitar. Since there are no wrong notes, the picking hand is free to strum using a bigger arm motion, and this chord is really fun to bang out on an acoustic or an electric. It's half the fun of playing the guitar, just bashing on an E chord. Now the A major triad also starts with the power chord shape, and then add the 4th finger on the 2nd string at the 2nd fret. Now I can play the open E string on top of that chord. Sometimes that's tricky to do because the fingers tend to crowd in there, and if you mute the high E string with your finger, that's okay too. So it can either be 4 strings or 5 strings. Now, depending on how big your fingers are and how close the strings are, how narrow the neck is, there's another alternate fingering for the A chord. So that's the first one. The second one, you bar with your 1st finger and then use your 2nd finger to play on the 2nd string. And then there's a 3rd fingering that a lot of people tend to use. I do in particular. And that's just 1 finger barring all 3 strings. Now the trick on this one is that you don't want to hear the high string. You don't want to bar that one too. So you play the inside strings and then just mute the top string naturally, and it's going to sound fine. Now you pick one of those fingerings, the one that feels the most comfortable, and we're going to combine the E major chord with the A major chord, like this. E major, A major. I'll use all 3 fingers for now. Back and forth. Now, when you change in tempo, that's when it's really important to have your finger moves all planned out. So again, without strumming, watch how the fingers move from chord to chord. And then when you strum, the only thing you got to watch out for is that you play the low E string on the E chord, and you don't on the A chord, so you have to aim the pick a little bit differently. Now after you've worked out that E to A move consistently, we're going to add the D chord. And starting with the D power chord fingering, add your 2nd finger on the 1st string at the 2nd fret. Now when you pick this chord, you have to avoid the 5th and 6th strings. So you're simply picking the top 4 strings, and that takes a little practice too. With all 3 chords, there are more possible combinations between the 3. You can go from E to A to D, back to E, back to D, and so forth. This is how songs are written. So you have to plan your finger movements for the smallest necessary motion. Whatever fingers you aren't using are held in the air just above the strings. You don't want them flying off like that because that's kind of inefficient. So again, practicing. Listen carefully that I'm not buzzing any of the notes or muting any of the notes. I want every note to come out nice and clean and clear. Now with all 3 of these chords in place, play along with practice track number 1 again, but use the major triads. It's the same chords, A, E, and D. But you're going to use the major triads instead of the power chords. And again, you can play 1 or 2 strokes per beat, and make sure you make your chord changes right on time. Okay, go ahead and mess with that and come on back when you're done. There are two more very common open position major chords, G and C. To play G, start with your fourth finger on the first string at the 3rd fret there, and next reach all the way across with your second finger to the 5th string, like this. Now you have to be careful to arch that finger up and away from the other strings so that you can hear them all. And finally you add your 3rd finger down here, all right? First finger's not being used in this one. If all the fingers are in the right position, it should sound just like that. And you have 3 open strings in this chord, so it's another big, chimey chord that sounds especially good, especially when you're playing an acoustic guitar. Now to play a C major chord, you take the 3rd finger that you were using on the G chord and the 2nd finger, and you move them over one set of strings, like that. Get rid of the 4th finger, and put your 1st finger down on the 2nd string at the 1st fret. Now this chord only includes the top 5 strings, so you skip the 6th string when you pick it. Naturally, when you finger some of these chords, you're going to find that your fingers bump up against the next string. Sometimes that's a bad thing, sometimes it's a good thing. And if you let the 3rd finger bump up against the 6th string on the C chord, you can strum away and not have to worry about it. Another nice big sounding chord. Now move back and forth from G to C a few times, and since the shapes are more alike than they are different, it's a smooth transition. Now when you have those 2 chords down to where you can get back and forth without thinking too hard, we're going to add the D chord to the mix. The D chord is one you already know, remember? And we're going to practice moving from G to C to D and back to G again. You lift and place the fingers as a group each time. Take it slow, play it clean. And with these 3 chords, you're ready for practice track number 2. This time add some variations in the picking pattern by combining quarter notes and 1/8 notes. I'll play along with the track for you to show you how it goes. Got it? Now concentrate on making the changes right on the beat. Relax, get your right hand going. You have to be a little careful on that D chord that you don't hit the strings you don't want, but once you get into it, it's a very comfortable groove to play to. Practice that for a little while, play with the track, and then come on back and we'll look at another category of chords. The next category of open position chords is minor triads. These are made by adding the 3rd degree of the minor scale to a power chord, and there are 3 common open position minor triads: E minor, A minor, and D minor. Now E minor is just like the E power chord, but now you can hit all 6 strings since the top 3 open strings belong to the same chord. This note here, the open 3rd string, that is the minor 3rd that I was talking about. That's a piece of cake. It's hardly even like learning a new chord, is it? Now the A minor chord is shaped like the E major triad that you already learned, but you move your whole hand over one set of strings, so now you're on the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. E major, A minor, it's identical, but now you pick from the open 5th string all the way up. Now practice going back and forth between the E minor and then A minor a few times. This is the easiest move yet. Now we'll add a new chord, which is called D minor. Now you remember D major and the D power chord, and we use a certain fingering, first finger, third finger, and then adding this finger up here for the major chord. Well, we're going to have to change that a little bit for the minor. Second finger, third finger, first finger. And I pick it from the fourth string. Right. So what I did is change the top note from major to minor. And I have a D minor chord. Now play back and forth from E to A to D. And again, what you can practice is without strumming the guitar, just practice the finger moves so that you're moving your hands as a group. Fingers come up and down together. Make it nice and clean, then add your picking hand. And be careful that you don't pick the wrong strings and make the chord changes right on the beat. Now you're going to go to practice track number 1 again. Practice track number 1 was A, D, and E. And the fact that these are minor tracks doesn't make any difference. You can still play them over the same track. So go ahead, back to that track and just come up with a new picking pattern in your right hand, play along with it, and when you're ready, come on back and I'll show you another category of chords. So far I've showed you 3 kinds of open chords: power chords, major chords, and minor chords, and I've got one more category to show you called dominant chords. Now dominant chords are very common, especially in a style like blues, where you use a lot of dominant 7th chords, as they're technically known. Now a dominant 7th chord is made by adding the lowered 7th degree of the major scale to a major triad. So the chord actually has 4 different notes in it. Dominant chords are shown on paper by putting the number 7 after the letter name of the chord, like E7. Now to play an E7 chord, you form an E major triad, use the familiar shape, and then you lift up the 3rd finger, which is on the 4th string, and that makes the 4th string now open. It's still a 6-string chord, so you have a lot of freedom, but you have that extra open string, and that's what makes it a dominant chord. Now to play an A7 chord, remember we had 3 different ways to finger the A chord. It's a little bit confusing. I'm going to pick a fingering for the A7 chord that is useful and common, and that is to use open A, of course, 2nd finger on the 4th string, open 3rd string, and then the 3rd finger over here. And then you can also play the open 1st string. Now it's not uncommon that you mute the 1st string just by accident, but that's okay too. So you can either play it as a 5-string chord or as a 4-string chord. The tricky part is getting that open G string to ring out because it's right in the middle of that bundle of fingers. Now practice going back and forth from E7 to A7 a few times and pay special attention to how the fingers move from chord to chord. Now we're going to add one more 7th chord, and this is D7. D7, like the others, is made by changing one of the notes that's in the major triad. So this is going to cause us to re-finger. Instead of playing the D major chord like that, I'm going to shift my fingers all around, play 3rd finger, 1st finger, 2nd finger, and then the open 4th string. Now the trick on this one is when you strum it, you don't pick the 5th or the 6th string, just the top 4. Now practice moving back and forth again between D7, A7, and E7. And it's that little choreography again, which you can practice without actually picking any of the notes, just left hand moving across the chords. Now you have A, you have D, and you have E, the same 3 chords that we use on practice track number 1. And you've already used practice track number 1 for power chords, major chords, and minor chords, and now you can play it again with dominant chords. Just go back and forth, follow the rhythm track, stay in tempo. You can make up any pattern you like in your picking hand and get comfortable with these 3 chords, and then I'll show you a couple more. There are 2 more dominant 7th chords in open position that are directly related to major triad voicings that you already know, and these are G7 and C7. Now the G7 chord is formed starting with the G major triad, and you're going to lift up your pinky on the first string there and replace it with the first finger. So now you wind up with the first finger here, open strings, and then the second and third fingers right where they were on the G chord. So there's G major, there's G7. Now the C7 chord, like the others, is formed by adding a note to the C major triad. There's the C major triad, and in this case I have to get all four fingers in on the action. So my pinky's going to go over here on the third string at the third fret, and I form that C major chord around it, and there's C7. Now practice going back and forth from G7 to C7 a few times. And again, paying attention to where each finger goes and moving the fingers as a group. Now we're going to add those two chords together with D7, which you already know, and with G7, C7, and D7, you're able to play with practice track number 2, which is in the key of G, and combines those three chords. So just as you did with the major chords and the minor chords, you can now play dominant chords over practice track number 2, and again, stay in tempo, make the chord changes real smooth, and when you're able to make it through that progression on time, you're ready to move on again. Love those open chords. They have that big ringing sound that really brings out the personality of the guitar. But you're also limited to just a few keys, and so we need to learn some movable chord shapes. With these shapes, you can quickly learn to play in any key. So in the next few lessons, we'll learn the most common and useful movable chord shapes. Now, power chords are at the heart of countless rock songs, and some of the most popular tunes of the past few decades have been written with the movable shapes that you're just about to learn. We'll start with the open position E power chord. First, play the chord with the normal fingering, and then replace those fingers with your third and fourth fingers, like this. That leaves these fingers up dangling in the air. Now, to make this into a movable chord, you're going to take those two fingers, move them up the neck 1 fret, and then put your first finger down on the 6th string. Right? Now we're playing E and F. Now the trick on that one is to arch your fingers, get them up out of the way so that they come down squarely on each note. Don't let the fingers bend backwards, which is going to be a common tendency at first. You have to keep them arched so that they go forward onto the string. The chord contains only the bottom 3 strings, but if you let your fingers naturally lay across the upper strings, in other words, let this finger just kind of brush against the top strings and mute them, you can pick more freely without hitting any bad notes. Now this is the same shape that you were playing in open position, but now the first finger has taken place of the open string, so it kind of becomes a movable nut in a way. The lowest note of this chord is the root, so you're now playing in F, and if you move your hand up 2 frets, you're playing in G. If you move it up again, you're playing in A, and so on. To play in any key, you just need to know the names of the notes on the 6th string. Now, if you don't know those already, check out the reference section of this program for a full explanation of how to find note names all over the neck. The same fingering is used to play power chords with roots on the 5th string. These chords don't include the 6th string, but when you finger the chord, if you let the side of the first finger naturally mute the 6th string, you can pick without worrying about hitting a bad note. Check it out. I'm going to play the A power chord. Remember, we played it like that at first. Substitute the same 2 fingers, move up a fret, use the first finger on the 5th string, and notice the tip of my first finger is actually bumping up against the 6th string. Normally we try to avoid that sort of thing. In this case, it's a good thing, because if I mute that string, I can whack away at the low strings and it all sounds good. And then I let the side of my finger rest against the high strings, and I can free up my right hand to play rhythm. Now you can combine the power chord shapes with the roots on the 6th string and the 5th string, just moving them back and forth. And of course, with these shapes, you can play in any position. So you can play progressions like A to D to E, for example. All within 2 frets, as opposed to using one shape off the 6th string, for example, where you'd go A all the way up to D, and then have to go all the way up to E. So being able to combine the 6th string root and the 5th string root is a real convenience when it comes to playing chord progressions up the neck. Now you've got 2 shapes, but they allow you to play any number of chords. The way you're going to work out on them first, though, is to go back to practice track number 1, which is combining the A chord, the D chord, and the E chord, and putting those 3 chords together in the same order that you've already done, but in a new position, is going to teach you how these power chord shapes fit together up the neck. Okay? Go work on that for a minute, and then come on back and I'll show you some more stuff. Major chords can also be moved around the neck using a technique known as the bar, and here's how it works. Start with the open E major chord. Now we're going to switch the fingering again to free up the 1st finger. So I'll go 3rd finger, 4th finger, 2nd finger. Notice the 1st finger dangling here. Move the whole thing up 1 fret, and then the 1st finger lays across all 6 strings, which is the technique known as barring. The 1st finger takes the place of the nut, and now the chord can be played in any key by moving that shape up the neck, just like we did with power chords. There's A, G, and F, for example. Now this is one of the trickier chord shapes to master, since it requires a pretty fair amount of pressure by the 1st finger to make the notes ring out clearly. And if your strings are heavy, or if the action is set fairly high, this can be a real workout. Now pick the notes one at a time to hear if they're all coming through clearly, and you have to adjust your fingers. What you really need to do is figure out where to place your 1st finger, moving it back and forth a little bit, because if one of the strings gets caught right where your finger bends, it'll tend to be muted. So you have to find that magic spot and then clamp that finger down like a vise. And after you play that chord for a couple of minutes, or probably even by now, your thumb and fingers are starting to feel a little bit sore. And if they do, you take a short break and just kind of relax them a little bit and then play again. And this is a real callus builder here. Now follow me and I'll show you a couple of different chords. You get your hand in position and I'll call out a chord and you find it along with me. Here we go. F. G, that's up 2 frets. We'll go to A, that's up another 2 frets. Let's go to C, that's all the way up here at the 8th fret. How about D? Now you might start to run out of room there. Let's go back down again. A. Right, you get the idea. It's the same exact shape every time, but we're changing keys simply by moving the hand up and down rather than having to learn new fingering. So it's a real convenience. Now there's a variation on this chord that's a little easier to play. It's not as big, but it uses the top 4 strings and what's called a partial bar. Now to play this chord, look at the F chord. Now we're going to get rid of the low strings here and just bar the top 2 like that. 2nd finger here, 3rd finger here. Thumb stays behind the neck, that's your clamp. And so now you're hearing top part of the chord, and we can move that up and down the same way. Now since the bottom 2 strings aren't used, you have to be careful when you pick this one. And in this shape, the root's easiest to find on the 1st string, which you recall has the same name as the 6th string. So you can actually look at the same frets and just finger it a little bit differently. Now major chords with roots on the 5th string are based on the open A shape. And recall we had several different fingerings for open A. I'm going to use the one that uses all the fingers. And you notice the 1st finger is already freed up on that one. So if I move that up a fret and then use my 1st finger, I can create a bar chord. Now I can play it as a 4-note chord like I just did, or include that high note, which is kind of tricky. This is a real bear to master at first because all the fingers are involved, a lot of pressure on the hand. Now you don't want to hear the sixth string, so you go ahead and let that first finger just mute it like that. Now, there's another fingering that's very common. It's one that I actually use all the time, and that's using a bar with the third finger. So my first finger is down on the fifth string, and my third finger is laying across the inside strings. Now this one's real tricky to play and get the top string to ring out, so this is basically a 4-string chord. And this requires an equal amount of pressure on this finger, but it takes some of the weight off of this one. Now you can take that shape and move it up. And after a while, you find out how much pressure you need to use, and it gets a little bit easier to play. Now combining 6th-string roots and 5th-string roots for major triads, we can go back and play the chord progressions again from the practice tracks, and you find that you can again compress the voicings into a very small area of the neck. So for example, A major at the 5th fret, D major, also at the 5th fret, E major at the 7th fret. Practice track number 2 includes a G chord, C chord, and a D chord. Right? Now when we played in open position, you had to learn all different shapes for each chord, but with the movable shapes, it's really the same shapes. You just have to know where you are on the neck. So go ahead and work on practice tracks number 1 and 2 and combine the major triad movable voicings together. We're starting to get fancy now, aren't we? And once you get those shapes down, you're able to play in tempo, come on back and I'll show you some more stuff. Minor chords can be moved around the neck just like power chords and major chords. Let me show you how. I'm going to start with E minor. And as we did before, change the fingering slightly, move up a fret, and clamp that first finger down. And there you have F minor. Now this chord's even a little trickier than F major because you've got an extra string that you need to bar with the first finger. We're barring the 3rd string as well. And so again, you're moving your finger back and forth until you find the sweet spot where you get all the strings clean and clear. And once you have that shape down, move it up and down the neck, same as the other chords. Now to play a 5th string minor chord bar, we'll start with A minor, change the fingering, 3rd, 4th, 2nd, first finger's free, move it up a fret, first finger comes down, and we're barring the top 5 strings. So the first finger's picking up the 5th string and the 1st string, and the tip of the finger rests against the 6th string, as it probably does normally. And you've got a nice minor chord that you can move up and play in any key again. Now you can combine the 2 shapes, 6th string root and 5th string root. There's G minor, C minor, and you can play these chords, minor chords, over the practice tracks again. Practice track number 1 in the key of A, practice track number 2 in the key of G. So get comfortable with those chords, come on back, and we'll wrap this whole thing up. The last category of movable chords is dominant chords, and just like power, major, and minor, we only need 2 shapes to get going and be able to play in any key. We'll start with E7. Remember, we formed E7 by modifying the E major chord, and now we're going to change the fingering a little bit. 3rd finger, 2nd finger, 1st finger, ready to bar, move it up, and there's F7. Now again, you're barring all these strings and you have to adjust your hands slightly until you find that sweet spot. But once you have that shape, then G7, A7, and so on. Now to play a dominant chord with a 5th string root and move it around, we'll start with A7. And we had that shape right there with the 2nd finger and the 3rd finger. Now we're going to take a step back actually and refinger that again. That A chord, boy, I tell you. Use your 3rd finger and your 4th finger. And then 1st finger's ready to go. Move it up a fret. This one's called B flat. B flat dominant 7. Starting to sound like we're playing some real music here, huh? Move that up. C7. B7, and so on. So now you've got a 6th string root and a 5th string root. Now, believe it or not, you had already learned a movable 5th string root dominant chord without even knowing it. And that was back when we learned C7. C7 has all 4 fingers, and if you play just the inside strings, you can move that up. There's D7, the root is right here on the 5th string. And there's E7. Now, going back to C, if you take that chord down a fret, what's that? That's B7. And we can refinger that one ever so slightly. 2nd finger, 1st finger, 3rd finger, open, 4th finger up on top. And you have one of the open chords again. So there's a real connection between those dominant chords and the open chords. Now in the open position, you've got E7, A7, and B7, which combine nicely with each other. And you can also play E7, A7, and B7. Or you could play E7 with another voicing like we learned, A7 and B7. You start to see how the different combinations work, and more possibilities means that you have more freedom on the guitar. Now we can combine E, A, and B into a single progression, just like we did with the first 2 practice tracks. And so this will be practice track number 3, and it's designed to help you work on moving from chord to chord in tempo with these dominant chords. So play over the track using the same kind of right hand rhythms you've already been using, and concentrate on getting your left hand to make the moves so that the chords sound nice and clean. And you can use either the open position dominant chords or the movable dominant chords. So take a crack at practice track number 3. I'll show you how it's done, a little demo here, and then you're on your own. Now between the open position and movable chords, you've already learned the most common chords used on thousands of records over the last 50 years. The best way to practice from here on is to play tunes that you know, starting with books of easy guitar arrangements and adding more chords and keys to your vocabulary as you go. Eventually, you'll be able to hear songs and figure out many of the chords by ear. You might be surprised how quickly that can happen. A chord is a group of notes played all together, and a scale is a group of notes lined up end to end and played one at a time. In the next few lessons, I'll show you the 2 most common scales used in rock, blues, country, and most other popular styles. And we're going to start by looking at picking technique, since this is really the key to playing single notes effectively. Now, chords and licks require a different kind of picking technique. To play single notes, you have to learn to be more accurate with the pick. So let's take a few minutes to concentrate exclusively on your picking hand. Starting with the open E string, for example, if I use downstrokes, it's a little limiting, and most players develop a combination of downstrokes and upstrokes called alternate picking that allows you to pick both faster and cleaner. Start by picking the open string first, down, and then up. You see, most of the action is centered in the wrist, and the hand is very relaxed. As the pick comes up, you avoid hitting the B string, and you make the downstrokes and upstrokes sound the same. Now, some players play with the heel of the hand resting on the strings like this, and others play with the hand arched like this. With the hand up in the air, you do have a little bit more flexibility, But if you play loud and with distortion, you're going to have to keep the heel of your hand down to get rid of some of the noise. So you really adjust your right hand according to the style that you're playing. Now move over to the B string. Now you got to watch out on both sides because you got strings to avoid. So the motion is very small. Same thing on the G string. And as you move across, of course, the whole shape of your hand changes relative to the guitar. Now, a good exercise is to pick each string 4 times, then move to the next string without skipping a beat or flubbing a note. And this is where a metronome comes in handy, because until you played for a while, you're going to tend to skip beats or change tempo, and you won't even know it. So that makes your technique kind of uneven. All popular music is played to a beat, so it's really important to play that way from the very beginning. And remember, one important rule about guitar playing: speed is a byproduct of accuracy. If you want to play fast, learn to play well, and the right speed at any given time is the one at which you can play perfectly. All right, now moving from string to string, 4 strokes. The idea? Now, another challenge is to play both an open string and a fretted note. The finger must land on the first fret at the precise instant that the pick hits the string, and it has to lift before the pick hits the open string. This is a little trickier than it looks, and it takes a little while to get good coordination and be able to do this quickly and cleanly. You don't want to do this too fast, because that's where you're going to get into the problems with your technique. So take it nice and slow. Now you can take that same idea, moving across the strings. Okay? Now crossing from string to string presents another picking challenge. Play the first string like this, and then the second string like that. I'm going to use a downstroke and then an upstroke on the second string. Down, up, down, up. Let me reverse the picking. Upstroke, downstroke. There's no right or wrong about upstrokes and downstrokes. It's just whatever makes the music come out right. And you can make this shape move across the neck. Alternate picking on one string and crossing from string to string are the 2 basic picking techniques that you need to play any scale pattern. Let's put these skills to work on 2 of the most popular scales in music, the major and minor pentatonics. Pentatonic scales have 5 notes as opposed to full major and minor scales that have 7. And pentatonics really contain the essence of the major and minor sound. Because they have fewer notes, they're actually easier to use. And in fact, the single most used scale in the history of blues and rock guitar is undoubtedly the minor pentatonic. Now to play the minor pentatonic, we're going to start by playing a chord. Play the A minor chord at the 5th fret. Strip it down to the top 4 strings. The minor pentatonic contains the notes in this chord plus 1 more on the 3rd string and 1 on the 2nd string. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the octave starts the thing all over again. So you can hear how closely the scale and the chord are related. Now let's look closely at the fingering. Begin with your 3rd finger on the 4th string. This is the tonic, or the beginning note of the scale. And now follow me and pick as I play too. We're going to use alternate picking. Downstroke, then go to the 3rd string, 1st finger, upstroke, 3rd string, 3rd finger on the 3rd string, downstroke, upstroke, 4th finger there, downstroke, upstroke, and you can actually add another note on top, downstroke, and come back down the scale. Don't interrupt your picking, upstroke, down, up, down, up, down. Now you have to keep your picking and fretting hands coordinated, and if you start missing notes, slow down. Remember, speed is the byproduct of accuracy. Let's play it together one more time. Here we go. 1. Add the top note. Now that's a lot to think about, even though it's only 5 notes, but once you've learned the pattern well enough that you don't have to stop and think about it, play the scale along with the practice track. Practice track number 1 in the key of A is a good place to start. This scale will work over all 3 chords in the progression, and you can start with 1 note per beat, then play 2 notes per beat. Again, it isn't a matter how fast you play, it's how well you play. And you don't have to change notes with every stroke of the pick either. You can repeat a note while you think about what to play next. Now when you're able to play up and down the pattern at 2 notes per beat without stopping or hitting a bad note, you have the fingering down pretty well. Go ahead and work with that practice track and come on back when you're ready. It's not hard to expand this scale onto the lower strings since the fingering is pretty similar in both directions. Starting with the 3rd finger again on the 4th string at the 7th fret, I go down to the 1st finger, 3rd, 1st, 4th, 1st. This pattern is often called a box because the shape of the fingers forms this nice compact little box that you can play inside of. And this is really home position for most soloists in practically every style. If you're in the key of A, you're at the 5th fret working around this area. Now practice the low strings separately. And then combine them with the high strings to make the pattern complete. You can play the pattern along with track number 1 again to bring the whole thing up to speed, including the low strings. And keep in mind too that the minor pentatonic scale isn't just for minor chords. You can play it over major chords or over dominant chords. Obviously it's the sound that we describe as bluesy, and it's a basic part of rock too. Now tracks number 2 and 3 are each in a different key. Track number 2 is in the key of G, and you can play over that by moving the same pattern to a different position. Since the same note, the tonic, is on the 6th string, 4th string, and 1st string, you can look at the bottom string, that's where most people look, and it's the same as looking for the root of a chord. So if I'm in A at the 5th fret, I'm in G at the 3rd fret. And that will be the position in which I play over track number 2. Same exact fingering, different position. If I want to play over track number 3, which is in the key of E, I actually have 2 choices. I can go to the 12th position. There's an E up there. That's where the 2 dots are, right? And I can play the same pattern. Or I can go down to the open position and play it down there. Now if you have an acoustic guitar, for example, that open position is probably going to be easier to get to than the 12th position. On electric, players like to go to the 12th position. The fingering in open position is a little bit different because we're not using the 1st finger anymore. So I use the 3rd finger and the 2nd finger, and then let the open strings take over. Now play along with the tracks to get used to each position and key, and then add some rhythm and change the order of the notes. In other words, improvise. That's half the fun of what playing a guitar is all about, just making stuff up. And it's a lot more fun when you have some skills to do it. You'll hear some of the notes of the scale sound better over certain chords than others, and a lot of great players have learned to play exactly the way we're doing it right now. You learn a couple of notes, you learn a couple of chords, you play, you hear which notes seem to work best, and you build licks to fit. You don't really have to know a lot about music, you have to use your ear. As your fingers get more comfortable with the pattern, you'll naturally be able to listen to yourself more, and that's when you can really start to make music. Now in the next lesson, I'll show you the companion to the minor pentatonic, which is called the major pentatonic scale. Like the minor pentatonic scale, the major pentatonic is a larger scale that's been stripped down to its essential notes. A major pentatonic scale contains the notes of a major triad with two other notes added between them. To see how it looks, start with an A major bar chord at the 5th fret. And we'll break it down to the top 4 strings. Now to turn this into a pentatonic scale, we'll add an extra note on the 3rd string and an extra note on the 2nd string. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the octave. And you can see how it fits around the chord, but the fingering's quite a bit different from the minor pentatonic. And there's a trick that guitar players use that makes them the same. Remember that the sound of the major pentatonic reflects the sound of the major chord. Now I'm going to move my hand down 3 frets and listen to that sound as I play this shape right here. It's exactly the same, right? But my hand's in a completely different position. Now what did I do? Well, I took the same fingering that I used on the minor pentatonic, moved it down 3 frets, and instead of putting the tonic on the 4th string, as I did on the minor pentatonic, it's now on the 3rd string. And so now the scale is based around A, but it's a major pentatonic. And this down 3 frets trick has been used by guitar players probably as long as these scales have been around. And a lot of classic licks, especially in country music, are built around this pattern. For example. Now since you already know the complete fingering, you didn't know that, did you? Go ahead and play along with track number 1 in the key of A, but this time with your hand in 2nd position. Now to make it sound musical, begin and end the pattern with the tonic notes that are on the 6th string, the 3rd string, and the 1st string. All right, now quickly reviewing the shape again. That's the tonic, and that's also the tonic. Now play the major pentatonic over tracks number 2 and 3 as well. Track number 2 in the key of G will put you either in the 12th position or in open position. Now if you play acoustic, play a G chord. That's a nice shape to go with that chord. Or you can play the same shape up in 12th position. Move my whole hand up there, and there's same pattern. Now track number 3, which is in the key of E, will put you in the 9th position. Now remember, major is always 3 frets down from minor. So when we played the minor pentatonic in E, we could play in 12th position. And when I play the major pentatonic in the key of E, I'm in 9th position, down 3 frets. So go ahead and play with tracks number 1, 2, and 3, and try this scale pattern out in all those keys. And when you feel like you've got it down, you don't have to think about it too hard, come on back and I'll show you some techniques. No matter what style of music or type of guitar you play, there are certain techniques used by nearly everyone that make simple scale patterns sound much more musical. And these fall into 3 categories: legato technique, sequences, and rhythm. Now legato is a musical term that means smooth and connected, and it's the sound that players work on the most. The basic idea is to avoid any gaps between the notes while at the same time not making them run together like they do in a chord. Now, if you play the notes of a scale out of order, pretty soon you run into a situation where you're playing two notes that are on the same fret but different strings. And if you lift your finger up when you move from string to string, you'll break the connection between the notes. Check it out. Let's say I want to play 5th fret 1st string, and the next note is on the 5th fret of the 2nd string. Now, if I play the 1st string, lift it up, and place it down again, I'm hopping. It makes the notes sound broken or staccato. The way to keep it legato or connected is to roll your finger like this. I play the first note with the side of my finger and roll to the tip. That way I never break contact with the string. And it's the same way going back in the other direction. Let's say I want to go from the 4th string to the 3rd string. I play the 4th string with my tip of my finger and roll to the side. So that rolling motion is one that keeps the notes of the scale sounding connected no matter what order you play them with. Now, here's an exercise that you can use on either the minor or the major pentatonic. Since they're both the same fingering, you can apply any of these technical things to both fingering patterns just by kind of thinking about where the root is or the tonic. So let's say we're in the key of A, playing on an A minor pentatonic. I'm going to play this sequence right here. I'm going to play the 1st string, 2nd string, now you see what I'm doing? I'm basically skipping a note of the scale. Instead of going in order, I'm playing the 1st note, then skipping one, going to the next, playing the 2nd note, skipping, then playing the 3rd note, skipping, and so on. Now, it turns out to be a little shape. Right? In other words, the fingers are always doing the same motion between the two strings. And so it's really not that complicated once you get it going. The trick is to make it sound smooth. Now, when you play up, you do the same thing in reverse. Play the 1st note, skip a note, play the next one, rolling your finger over, right? This is really just practicing legato technique. Now you can use this exercise when you're playing over the rhythm tracks. The rhythm tracks make it feel more musical because it has some form and direction. And you can play over track number 1 in the key of A, track number 2 in the key of G, track number 3 in the key of E. Use major pentatonic, use minor pentatonic. Start with 1 note per beat, then go to 2 notes per beat. And this is how you can kind of keep the flow going and not lose your place in a scale because you hop from note to note. Now, another technique for reorganizing scale notes to sound more like music is called the sequence. And sequences are short scale segments that can be repeated up or down throughout a pattern. Most players in nearly every style use sequences to create interesting ideas from scales and also as technique exercises. The legato exercise I just showed you is a 2-note sequence. In other words, it keeps repeating throughout the pattern. A very common alternative sequence is a 3-note pattern. Here's how it sounds. Right? Now I'm playing 3 notes in a row, and then I'm beginning the sequence again on another note and moving down through the pattern. Let me play it slowly for you. We're in A minor pentatonic again, and I'm going to play with my 4th finger on the highest note of the pattern to my 1st finger, then to the 2nd string. That's the pattern, that's the sequence. 3 notes in a row. Then I go back and play the next scale tone and play 3 notes in a row. So, and continue, and so on. Now I can also do it without pausing between the sequences. And so on, down to the bottom of the pattern, and coming back up the same thing. 3 notes in a row, start on the next scale tone, 3 notes in a row, Now this is a technique exercise, but it's also musical because you can use sequences as part of an improvisation. For example, you hear the idea? It starts to make the scale pattern sound more like a piece of music, and that's really what we're after. Now the third technique, which is kind of an extension of the original legato technique, is called the hammer-on. And hammer-ons, together with pull-offs, are legato techniques for playing notes without picking by using your fretting hand to produce the sound. Here's how hammer-ons work. Start with your first finger on the 4th string at the 5th fret, okay? Pick the note. Now, without picking again, hammer your 3rd finger down at the 7th fret. If you do it hard enough, you'll hear the 2nd note just as clearly as the 1st. Now, it's called a hammer-on for a reason. You're hammering that note, and it takes some strength to do that. Do the same thing on the 3rd string. Pick the 1st note, hammer the 2nd note. Just bring it down as hard as you can. On the 2nd string, 1st finger and 4th finger. A lot of people try to skate around using the pinky. You don't want to do that. Might as well use it. You got one, so make use of it. And you can build up the strength of your pinky just by doing exercises like this. And on the 1st string, it's the same. Now, as an exercise, go through the whole pentatonic scale pattern from the 1st down to the 6th string and back, and use all hammer-ons. Now remember, this could be an A minor scale. It could also be a C major scale. By changing the chord that I'm playing over, it changes the sound of the scale. So that one pattern is either minor or major, and that means that the same exercise covers both sounds. So playing hammer-ons on that pattern applies to both. Now pull-offs are the opposite of hammer-ons. That is, you pick the higher note and then you use your fretting hand to sound the lower note without picking. Here's how it works. Play the 4th string at the 7th fret with your 3rd finger, just like this. Now at the same time, put your 1st finger down at the 5th fret, okay? So you have 2 fingers down at once, all right? Now pick the 1st note, which is the 3rd finger, and then pull your finger to the side. And what you're doing is actually snapping that string like that. And if you do it hard enough, the 2nd note sounds just like you picked it. So I'm pulling it down toward the floor, and as I do, I pull the string and then snap it, and I release it to my 1st finger there. All right? Do the same thing on the 3rd string. Now here's a trick. 2nd string, you're going to have to use your pinky here. And 1st string. Now as an exercise, go down. Remember, you have to place both fingers at the same time before you use the pull-off. Now, a very common way to apply pull-offs is in a 3-note sequence, like the first one that we did. But instead of picking every note, you pull off to the 1st note, or from the 1st to the 2nd, and then pick the last note. So pick, pull off, pick, and then you can continue the sequence with pull-offs like pick, pick, pull off, pick, pull off, pick. You get the idea. Hammer-ons and pull-offs can be combined by picking, hammering, and then pulling in one continuous motion. Right? I hammer, and then I pull. You do this fast enough, and it's called a trill. You can take this across the whole pattern too. Now your hand may start to get tired, and this is normal because you're using certain muscles a lot. This is really building up your fretting hand strength. But after a while, you'll be able to play these kinds of licks non-stop. Now, a lot of players find that they can play faster and cleaner with hammer-ons and pull-offs than they can with the pick, whereas other players like to pick every note because they like the sound, the attack. And you can just think of them as different sounds with different applications in different styles. And as you listen to players that you like, read guitar magazines, or just study their hands when you see them on a video, you can find out how the players that you like the most play, and you can build up your own ideas from emulating them. Now, the final technique for making use of the scale patterns, turning them into music, is basically to use rhythm. Playing up and down the scale in tempo is a great way to learn fingerings and technique, but when the rhythm never changes, the music starts to sound pretty technical. And without learning any more advanced techniques, you can make the scale sound more interesting just by adding some rhythmic variety. A great way to do this is first you hum a rhythmic idea before you play, and then you match the notes to it. It's not really an exercise, it's more of a concept. So for example, I'm in the key of A, using the A minor pentatonic, and I'm going to think of a rhythm. I'm not thinking about notes at all. I go, huh, 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 huh. All right, pretty corny, but it works. And now I'm going to match some notes to it. Ba, 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 da, ba, da, da, da. Or I'll change the notes. You get the idea. I'm playing a rhythmic idea that's just as important as the melodic idea. And when you put the rhythm and the melody together, you get music. You've learned a lot so far about the basic techniques and concepts of playing the guitar, and with the scales and chords you've learned so far, you'll be surprised at how much you already understand about how more advanced players play. Remember, once you know what to do and how to do it, the rest is really just doing it, and that's what every guitar player does every time he or she picks up a guitar. Best thing about it is, the more you do it, the more fun you'll have. It's much easier to understand what you're playing on the guitar if you know something about the language of music. These musical names and symbols are a sort of verbal shorthand that will allow you to learn much more quickly and effectively. In this lesson, we're going to learn the basic language of notes, scales, chords, and rhythms, enough to get you started and enough to let you understand a surprising amount about music. First, let's talk about notes. Now, like any written language, music has an alphabet, and it's the same as the first 7 letters of the standard alphabet: A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. The note A happens to be the name of the second biggest string on the guitar, the 5th string. And starting with the open string, we can find all of the other notes in order as we move up the neck. There's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and we return to A again. Now, as you go up in pitch, you move forward through the alphabet, and as you go down in pitch, A, G, F, E, and so on, you move backward through the alphabet. Now, some notes are 2 frets apart, which is called a whole step, and some, B and C, and E and F in particular, are only 1 fret apart, which is called a half step. You can see this clearly on a keyboard where there are no black keys between the E and the F and the B and the C. But on the guitar, you'll learn where the half steps are as you learn the names of chords and scales. Now, the 8th note, which has the same name as the first, is called the octave. And the first note is called the tonic. It's the basic note of the scale. From the octave, the same note names start over again. A, B, C, and so on. Now, the notes between whole steps have names too. When a note, say G, is raised a half step, it's called sharp, G sharp, which is indicated by a sharp sign. And when it's lowered, it's called a flat, which is indicated by a flat sign. The first step in learning the names of the notes on the neck is to learn the notes on the 6th and 5th strings. Once you know these, you can find the root of any chord in any key. Now, starting with the open strings, the easiest way to figure out the rest of the notes is simply to know that there's a half step, 1 fret, between E and F and between B and C. Everything else is 2 frets. Starting with the open A string, for example, A, well, it's going to be 2 frets up to B, then 1 fret from B to C, then 2 frets to D, 2 frets to E, 1 fret between E and F, 2 frets to G, and 2 frets back to A. Now there's 2 dots up here and 2 dots on the side that always tell you where the octave is. On the 6th string, same rule applies. There's a half step between E and F and a half step between B and C. The open string is E, so that means 1 fret gives you F, then it's 2 frets to G, 2 frets to A, 2 frets to B, 1 fret to C, 2 frets to D, and then we find the octave at the 12th fret. Now you can memorize these notes in relation to the dot markers so that you can quickly find your way around the neck. That's what they're there for after all. So once you've learned the names of the notes on the 6th string, you know that the first dot's at the 3rd fret. That's G, A, B. Now that one falls in between C and D, so it would be C sharp or D flat, and then you're up at the octave here. So the dot markers are a big help. Now there's a trick that will help you learn the notes on the other strings too, based on the 5th and 6th strings, and these are called octave shapes. The octave, or the 8th note of the scale, has the same name as the first note. Knowing octave shapes on the guitar is extremely valuable because if you know the name of a note on the 6th string and you know how to play an octave, you can find the same note on other strings. Here's how it works. Play a note, say A, on the 6th string at the 5th fret with your first finger. Now the octave of A, the shape of it, puts it on the 4th string with the 3rd finger, up 2 frets. Got it? Now if you can find the name of any note on the 6th string and play the octave shape, then you also know the names of all these notes on the 4th string. This is A, this is A. If I play C, then I got C on the 4th string. If I play G on the 6th string, then I play G on the 4th string. Now the 1st string's tuned just like the 6th string. So actually if I know where G is, I know 2 other Gs just by comparing the shapes. So I've automatically got the 4th and the 1st strings figured out by using octaves. Same idea also works from the 5th string. You play a note, say D, the 5th fret, use the same octave shape as we did from the 6th string. That's over 2 strings and up 2 frets. And now I've got Ds on the 3rd string, D and D. If I go up to E, I know where E is on the 3rd string. If I go down to C, I can find C on the 3rd string as well. With a slightly different octave shape, I can find notes on the 2nd string. For example, starting with A on the 6th string, I play A on the 4th string, and then from A on the 4th string, I play a different octave shape, which uses the 1st finger and the 4th finger, and that puts me on the 2nd string. So A, 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 A. So by comparing the 2nd string to the 4th string, I know the names of the notes basically all over the neck. I got them all covered by comparing them to the lowest strings. Now after you play around with the octaves for a little bit, you'll begin to see shapes and recognize notes more easily, and eventually you'll be able to name every note on the neck. Next, let's learn something about how notes are put together to form scales. The basic scale to which all other scales are compared is the major scale. In a major scale, some of the notes are 1 fret or a half step apart, and some of the notes are 2 frets or a whole step apart. For instance, to play the key of A, major, I go up a whole step, another whole step, and then the half step is between the 3rd and 4th scale degrees. Then it's a whole step, whole step, whole step, and then a half step between the 7th and 8th scale degrees. Each note of the major scale is given a number 1 through 7, and the octave is called 8. So using the numbers or the scale degrees, you can describe the unique pattern of the major scale by simply saying there are 2 half steps, one between the 3rd and 4th notes and the other between the 7th and the 8th. All the rest are whole steps, and no matter what note you start the major scale from, it'll always have the same pattern of whole steps and half steps. If I start on D, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Major scales aren't the only scales, of course. Another scale that's just as common is the minor scale. Like the major scale, it's got its own unique pattern of whole steps and half steps. In this case, there's a half step between the 2nd and 3rd scale degrees, and another between the 5th and 6th. You can hear the effect that this change in the half steps has on the sound. The most important difference is in the 3rd scale degree. This is called, in a major scale, the major third, which is a sound that's described as bright or happy. And when that step is moved down a half step to form the minor third, the sound is usually described as dark or sad. Not all scales have 7 notes. In fact, 2 of the most common and useful scales in popular music around the world, and the ones that we're working with in this video, have only 5. And these are called pentatonic scales, with the word pentatonic meaning 5 tones. They come in 2 common varieties, major pentatonic and minor pentatonic. The major pentatonic is a major scale minus the 4th and 7th notes, leaving the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 6th. Major scale sounds like this. Taking out the 4th and the 7th, I wind up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes. Now the minor pentatonic is a minor scale minus the 2nd and 6th notes, which leaves the root or tonic, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 7th notes. The minor pentatonic scale, or slight variations, is used quite a bit in blues, and so it's often called interchangeably the blues scale. Although there are many different types of chords that you can play on the guitar, in popular music there are 4 main types of chords that are used most of the time, with most of the rest being variations on these. First is the major triad. The word triad means group of 3, and triads contain 3 notes. The notes of the major triad are the same as the 1st, 3rd, and 5th notes of the major scale. To play these as a chord, we arrange them on separate strings, with the first note, called the root, usually played on the bottom. The same 3 notes can be arranged in different ways, and any of the notes can be doubled in different octaves to make 4, 5, or 6 note triads. These different arrangements of notes are called voicings. Second is the minor triad. Again, it's a 3-note chord, but this time it's built from the 1st, 3rd, and 5th notes of the minor scale. Notice that the root and the 5th are the same as in the major triad, only the 3rd is different. But it's a huge difference in the sound and feel of the chord. Like major triads, minor triads can be arranged in different voicings in any key, anywhere on the neck. The 3rd most common chord type has a fancier sounding name. It's called the dominant 7th chord, or often just the dominant chord. This chord contains 4 notes, the 1st, 3rd, and 5th notes of the major scale, plus the lowered 7th. As you can hear, it has a sound that's very different from the other 2, and it's used either in combination with triads or in blues as the basic chord of the style. The last chord type is a chord that's barely a chord. It only has 2 different notes in it, but it's one of the most widely used chords in rock and many other styles of music. It contains only the 1st and 5th notes of the major scale, and it's called a power chord. Since the chord has no third in it, it's not technically either major or minor, making it a very useful chord in a wide variety of progressions. On the guitar, it's one of the easiest chords to play, and thousands of songs have been recorded with power chords as the main rhythm part. Between major triads, minor triads, dominant seventh chords, and power chords, you know enough already to play literally thousands of songs. These four chord types are the basis of most popular musical styles, including rock, country, and blues. You'll see these chords and all the rest written on sheet music in the form of chord symbols, which is a form of notation that allows you to quickly build the right chord once you know these basic concepts and what the symbols mean. Now that we've explained scales and chords, let's look at the third ingredient that makes up the basic structure of music. It's just as important as the other two, and sometimes even more so. I'm talking about rhythm. Rhythm is how we describe time in musical terms. Just as a clock divides the day into minutes and hours, rhythm divides time into beats and bars. When you tap your foot in time with a piece of music, each foot tap is called a beat. Beats are arranged in groups called measures or bars, and the most common number of beats in a measure is 4. A single note that lasts for an entire measure of 4 beats is called a whole note. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. One that lasts for 2 beats is called a half note. 1, 3, 4. And a single beat itself is called a quarter note. As you can see, it's a lot like fractions. Each beat divides into 2 smaller beats. If the quarter note's divided in half, it's called an eighth note. And eighth notes divide into 16th notes. Although in theory you can keep going, the 16th note is the smallest beat you'll find in most popular music. In certain rhythms like blues, beats are divided into 3 equal parts called triplets, and the most common of these is the eighth note triplet. The way you feel music isn't in parts of beats, though. It's in how the beats combine to form larger patterns. To describe the basic rhythmic pattern of a piece of music, we use a time signature. This looks like a fraction, too, with 2 numbers, one above the other. The top number shows how many beats are in a measure, most often 4, and the bottom number shows what kind of note gets 1 beat, most often the quarter note, which is symbolized by a 4 as well. That makes 4/4 the most common time signature in popular music, whether you're playing rock, funk, blues, Latin, or practically anything else. Now you have an idea of the basic language of music and how it's expressed through notes, scales, chords, and rhythms. Of course, there's a great deal more to be learned on all of these subjects, and one of the best ways to learn it is to take music classes or to go through some of the books that exist about music theory with the help of a knowledgeable teacher. Learning music is a lot like learning any language. You'll learn a lot faster if you go to somebody who already speaks it, and before long, you'll be able to find your way around on your own.